Our gospel reading this morning comes from the 14th chapter of Luke. Jesus is by this time on his way to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem continues to hang heavy over all that happens. And so let us listen for what the Spirit may say to us through these words today. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. And in the intervening verses, Jesus does a healing on the Sabbath, which causes its own problems. But then we pick up the story later. Jesus has arrived at this home, and when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. Parable in Jesus' day referred both to stories that we think of as parables, but also simply to wisdom sayings. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you're invited, go and sit down at the lowest place so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He also said to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you should be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In an article on today's gospel reading, Emily Towns, an American Baptist pastor and professor of theology at Yale Divinity School, recalls something she heard frequently as a child spoken by her grandmother. "I just want to be a blessing," her grandmother said. "That's what I want for my life, to be a blessing to others." And Dr. Towns related how her understanding of the meaning of blessing developed as she grew up, from a reward to good little girls and boys to a complex, nuanced, difficult, and deeply theological understanding. And if you're familiar at all with Luke's version of the Beatitudes, you may already have some appreciation of the difficult, complex nature of blessing. "Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry now. Blessed are you who weep now. Blessed are you when people hate you." And there's a corresponding list of woes or curses for those who are rich, full, laughing, and spoken well of by others. When I first read those words of Dr. Towns' grandmother, I immediately recalled something from my seminary days. I don't know if this happens to other people, but sometimes when I have one of those powerful moments of insight or discovery, it becomes for me a vivid memory that stays with me seemingly forever. And I have one of those around the topic of blessing. It came in my introductory Old Testament class. We had been assigned to translate God's call to Abram in Genesis 12. And if you were to look that up in your pew Bible, you would see, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. That was a passage that I knew well, and so I was surprised when I discovered that the Hebrew had something quite different in it. It said, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. So be a blessing.'" Be a blessing. It was an imperative, a command, just like the command, "Go." And somehow, Dr. Towns' grandmother had picked up that command as her own. And thoughts of being a blessing bounced around in my head as I considered this story of Jesus at a Sabbath banquet. It starts off in mundane enough fashion. Jesus notices some of the guests sitting in the very best seats, and he tells a parable. He reminds them of banquet etiquette. There's nothing really earth-shaking here. It sounds like a number of different proverbs. Proverbs 25 says, "Do not put yourself forward in the place of the king, or stand in the place of the great. It is better to be told, 'Come up here,' than to be put lower in the presence of a noble." No doubt there were some at the banquet who nodded in agreement as Jesus played the wise rabbi and dispensed this well-known piece of wisdom. But banquet etiquette was just an opening. Jesus had more important things to do. This was simply an opportunity for Jesus to talk about the ways of God's kingdom, God's coming new day, and to remind us of our calling to be a blessing by living out the ways of that new day now. In the verses that come immediately after the ones we just heard, Jesus tells these same banquet guests a parable about a great banquet. It's clearly a metaphor for God's coming kingdom, and its guest list includes the poor and the crippled and the lame and blind, the same people Jesus tells his host that he should invite. Issues of hospitality and table fellowship were critically important in the culture of Jesus' day. And wedding banquets and dinner parties were the primary social occasions in that culture. They were of much greater social importance and significance than similar events are in our day, but the process for coming up with a guest list seems not to have changed very much. People tended to invite friends, relatives, people they wanted to impress, people who had invited them before, and so on. But Jesus says that the ways of the kingdom are vastly different. Conventional guest lists tend to conform to the status quo. They tend to perpetuate the insider-outsider boundaries of that culture. And so those who want to live by the ways of God's new day have to act differently. To be a blessing, Jesus says, here's who you should invite to share your table. And this issue of table fellowship is of crucial importance for Luke's gospel and for its companion book, Acts. The risen Christ is known in the breaking of the bread. And his new community welcomes in those once thought of as outsiders and not on the guest list. One of the wonderful things about the welcome table ministry here in this congregation is that, at least for a moment, it embodies Jesus' new guest list. It's a striking inversion to see. People who are often more accustomed to being served are bussing tables, cooking food, serving people who very often are relegated to second-class status. In the foundational documents of our denomination, there's a classic statement known as the great ends of the church. The last of these 6 ends or purposes is the exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world. And sometimes I think that the kingdom, God's new day, is nowhere more visible here than it is at welcome table. Which is why I'm thrilled that we are expanding welcome table to twice a month, even though that puts significant strains on an already inadequate welcome table budget and on our volunteer corps as well. There's a different sort of welcome table here in the sanctuary today. Granted, it's more of a symbolic meal, but it is supposed to be very similar to that Wednesday welcome table. It's easy for that similarity to get lost, for this to become thought of as something that's a part of our worship, something done for us, the members of this congregation. But this is a table of blessing, one that is supposed to make the kingdom visible. Jesus is the host here, and he serves us, but he also expects us to invite others, to expand the guest list beyond those who are like us, beyond those who can help us. Here, we are to embody that alternative community that Jesus came to proclaim. Whoever you are, however it is you found yourself here this Sunday morning, Jesus welcomes you, and he invites you to the table. Jesus feeds all who are hungry, nourishing us with God's grace. And having fed us at the welcome table, Jesus calls us to be a blessing, to live and to worship in ways that show the world what God's welcome table looks like. All praise and glory to the one who gave himself to be a blessing for us and who calls us to follow him and to be a blessing too.